The clock on Sarah Johnson's dashboard showed 11:30 p.m. as she drove down the quiet streets of Oak Ridge. Her mind was still buzzing with joy from the successful charity event she'd organized, which had raised over $50,000 for the local children's hospital. Streetlights cast long shadows across her silver Mercedes, a car she'd saved up for years to buy, working double shifts as a teacher before becoming a full-time community organizer. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah checked her speed. She was going exactly at the limit. With a small sigh, she turned on her indicator and pulled over to the side of Fleming Road, a poorly lit stretch with closed shops on both sides. Following everything her husband, Marcus, had taught her, Sarah kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. She turned on her interior light and reached for her phone, quietly starting a video recording before placing it in the cup holder, lens facing outward. Two officers approached her car, one on each side. The taller one, whose nameplate read Officer Richards, shined his flashlight directly into her face while his partner, Officer Brooks, stood watching with his hand resting on his holster. "License and registration," Richards barked, his tone unnecessarily harsh. Sarah noticed he wasn't wearing his body camera, a detail Marcus always said to watch for. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied calmly, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." Richards didn't respond, just kept the light trained on her face. Sarah moved slowly, narrating each action. "I'm opening the glove compartment now. I'm taking out the registration. Now I'm reaching for my purse." As she handed over her documents, Officer Brooks suddenly spoke up. "Pretty nice car for this neighborhood. How'd you afford this?" Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the implication in his tone, but kept her professional demeanor. "I own a successful community organizing business, officer. We just finished hosting a charity event for the children's hospital." Richards snorted, flipping through her documents with obvious disdain. "Community organizing. Right. Step out of the car." "May I ask why, officer?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah questioned, her heart pounding harder now. She glanced at her phone, making sure it was still recording. "Oh, look at that, Brooks," Richard sneered, noticing her phone. "She's one of those people who think they know their rights." "I do know my rights," Sarah replied firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "And I have the right to know why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle." The situation was escalating quickly. Sarah could feel the hostile energy rolling off both officers. Making a quick decision, she pressed her car's speed dial, calling Marcus. As the phone began to ring, Officer Richards' face twisted with anger. "Turn that phone off right now," he shouted, but Sarah had already heard Marcus pick up. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Marcus's voice came through clearly. "Marcus, honey, I'm being pulled over on Fleming Road near the post office. Two officers, Richards and Brooks. They're asking me to exit the vehicle without cause, and Officer Richards isn't wearing his body camera." The change in the officer's demeanor was instant. Brooks straightened up, taking a step back, while Richard's face went pale at hearing Marcus's name. They knew exactly who Marcus Johnson was, one of the city's most prominent civil rights attorneys. But instead of backing down, Richard's expression hardened with determination. Sarah could see something dangerous flash in his eyes, and she knew this night was far from over. "Get out of the car now." Officer Richards grabbed the door handle, yanking it open so hard that Sarah's seatbelt locked. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of danger. Sarah's phone was still connected to Marcus, who could hear everything. "Babe, I'm already in the car. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Marcus's voice came through clearly. "Stay calm and keep recording." Officer Brooks circled around to the driver's side, his boots crunching on loose gravel. "You heard my partner. Out of the car." His hand was still resting on his holster, a detail that made Sarah's mouth go dry. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt with shaking hands but remained seated, I need you both to tell me why I'm being asked to leave my vehicle. I have the right to know." Richards reached in and grabbed Sarah's arm. She pulled back instinctively, causing him to tighten his grip. "Playing lawyer now, just like your hotshot husband." "You're hurting me," Sarah said loudly and clearly, making sure her phone caught every word. "I'm complying, but you're using excessive force." Her teacher's training kicked in. "Stay calm, speak clearly, document everything." As Sarah stepped out of her car, she saw more clearly that both officers had disabled their body cameras. The red recording lights were off. Officer Brooks was sweating despite the cool night air, constantly looking up and down the empty street. "Search the car," Richards commanded Brooks, pushing Sarah roughly against the side of her Mercedes. "I bet we'll find something interesting in there." "You don't have probable cause," Sarah stated firmly, wincing as Richards twisted her arm behind her back. "This is illegal detention and harassment." "Shut up," Richards hissed, but Sarah could hear the edge of panic in his voice. They knew they'd messed up by targeting her, but instead of backing down, they were doubling down. Brooks started tearing through her car, throwing her charity event materials onto the street. Programs, donation records, and children's hospital brochures scattered across the asphalt. Sarah watched in horror as he ripped open her laptop bag, dumping its contents. "Look what we have here," Brooks announced, holding up a small bag he pulled from under the passenger seat. Sarah's eyes widened. She'd never seen it before. "That's not mine," she said immediately, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You just planted that. It's all on video." The mention of the video made both officers freeze. Richards's grip on her arm loosened slightly as the reality of their situation began to sink in. They'd disabled their cameras, but Sarah's phone was still recording everything. And Marcus Johnson, the city's most feared civil rights attorney, was on his way. In the distance, Sarah heard the distinctive rumble of Marcus's car, a sound she knew by heart. Officer Brooks heard it too, his face turning pale under the streetlights. But Richards' expression turned from panic to something darker. "Brooks, check the engine. Something smells funny," Richards ordered, a dangerous edge to his voice. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized what they were planning. "Don't you dare," she warned, trying to turn around. "My phone has everything. The nearby businesses have security cameras. You can't." "Shut up," Richards shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. "Brooks, do it now." Sarah could hear Marcus's car getting closer, the engine sound growing louder. Officer Brooks popped her car's hood, his hands shaking as he reached for something in his pocket. The streetlight caught the glint of metal in his hand. "Please," Sarah said, no longer speaking to the officers, but to whatever higher power might be listening. "Please let Marcus get here in time." The sound of screeching tires echoed from around the corner. But Brooks had already disappeared under her car's hood, and Sarah could smell something burning. The first wisp of smoke curled up from under Sarah's car hood like a ghost in the night air. Her heart nearly stopped as she watched Officer Brooks scramble away from her Mercedes, his face showing a mix of panic and sick satisfaction. The smell of burning rubber and chemicals filled the air. "What did you do?" Sarah screamed, trying to break free from Officer Richards's grip. "That's my car. Everything I need for work is in there." The smoke was getting thicker now, changing from gray to an ominous black. "Stand back." Richards yanked her away as the first flames became visible, licking around the edges of the hood. The fire was spreading fast, too fast to be natural. Sarah knew they must have used some kind of accelerant. "My laptop. The donation records." Sarah struggled harder, watching helplessly as flames began to climb up her windshield. Inside the car, she could see her phone still recording, the screen glowing through the growing inferno. All the evidence was in there, along with years of her work, photos, and memories. Officer Brooks backed away from the burning vehicle, his boots scraping against the asphalt. "Richards, we need to get out of here." His voice cracked with fear as the fire grew larger, illuminating the street with an orange glow. The heat was intense now, forcing them all to move further back. Sarah watched in horror as her car, which she'd spent years saving for, transformed into a blazing inferno. The paint bubbled and peeled, the windows started to crack, and thick black smoke poured into the night sky. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. "At least let me get my work files. Those children are counting on that donation money." But Richards held her firmly, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave bruises. A loud pop made everyone jump. The rear tire had exploded from the heat. The sound echoed off the empty storefronts like a gunshot. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Someone in the nearby apartments must have called 911. "We need to call this in," Richards said, trying to sound official despite his shaking voice. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we have a vehicle fire at..." But before he could finish, a powerful engine roared around the corner. Marcus's black SUV screeched to a halt about 50 feet away. The headlights cut through the smoke, creating eerie shadows that danced across the scene. Sarah had never been so relieved to see anything in her life. "Get your hands off my wife." Marcus's voice boomed across the parking lot as he stepped out of his vehicle. Even from a distance, his imposing figure in a perfectly pressed suit commanded attention. Behind him, another car pulled up. David Chen, his law firm's best investigator, was already filming everything with a professional camera. Officer Richards finally released Sarah's arm, but it was too late. The damage was done, both to her car and to their careers. The fire had reached its peak now, the entire vehicle engulfed in flames that reached toward the sky like angry fingers. "Sarah, are you hurt?" Marcus called out, walking forward with measured steps, his phone held high and recording. "Don't move, honey. Let them dig their grave deeper." The officers looked at each other, real fear replacing their previous arrogance. They were trapped between the burning car they'd destroyed and the civil rights attorney they'd foolishly angered. The sound of fire truck sirens grew closer. Marcus's voice was cold as ice as he approached. "This is what we call a career-ending mistake, gentlemen." He nodded to David, who was circling the scene, capturing every detail on camera. "And I promise you, this is just the beginning." The fire cast strange shadows across everyone's faces as they stood in a tense standoff. Sarah finally broke free from Richards and ran to Marcus, who wrapped one protective arm around her while keeping his phone steady, still recording. Behind them, her Mercedes continued to burn, a bright beacon of injustice that would soon light the way to major changes in their city's police department. Marcus Johnson walked toward the burning car with the confidence of a man who had fought and won hundreds of civil rights cases. His perfectly polished shoes crunched over broken glass as he approached Officers Richards and Brooks, who now stood awkwardly beside their patrol car. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he announced, though everyone present already knew exactly who he was. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your careers." His voice remained calm, but carried enough power to be heard clearly over the crackling flames. David Chen, the investigator, circled the scene like a hawk, his camera capturing everything. The burning car, the scattered charity documents, the officers' disabled body cameras, and most importantly, the growing bruises on Sarah's arm where Richards had grabbed her. "Sir, this was a routine traffic stop that..." Officer Brooks started to explain, but Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it for your union rep. You'll need a good story to explain why you pulled over a respected community leader, assaulted her, and destroyed her property." Marcus pointed to the shops lining the street. "You see those buildings? Ming's Restaurant, Joe's Hardware, Quick Stop. They all have security cameras. And guess what? They're all my clients." The color drained from both officers' faces. Richards unconsciously touched his disabled body camera, realizing too late the magnitude of their mistake. The fire trucks were getting closer now, their sirens piercing the night air. "Sarah, sweetheart," Marcus called to his wife while keeping his eyes fixed on the officers. "Tell me exactly what happened. nice and loud for the camera. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. They pulled me over without cause, ordered me out of the car illegally. When they heard I was your wife, Officer Richards grabbed me. She rolled up her sleeve, showing the dark marks forming on her arm. David zoomed in with his camera, documenting every detail. And then, she continued, Officer Brooks did something under my hood. The car caught fire almost immediately after. That's a lie. Richards burst out, but his partner's panicked expression told a different story. Brooks was sweating heavily now, his eyes darting between the burning car and his escape routes. The first fire truck arrived, its red lights painting the scene in surreal colors. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. Judge Thompson. Marcus Johnson here. Yes, I know it's late, but I need an emergency evidence preservation order. Yes, for all security footage within a 5-block radius of Fleming Road and 5th Street. And I need it now. The firefighters jumped into action, working to control the blaze that had once been Sarah's car. Marcus turned to David. Got everything. Every second, David confirmed, still filming, including Officer Brooks dropping something when he came out from under the hood. It's right there by the curb. All eyes turned to a small metal object glinting in the firelight, what looked like a lighter or some kind of tool. Brooks instinctively moved to pick it up, but Marcus's voice stopped him cold. Touch that evidence, and I'll add tampering charges to the list, he warned. 2 more cars pulled up. Internal affairs investigators that Marcus had called on his way over. Perfect timing, he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Sarah watched as her husband orchestrated everything with practiced precision. The internal affairs officers approached, their faces grim. They'd worked with Marcus before and knew his reputation for building airtight cases. Officers Richards and Brooks, one of the IA investigators, announced, "You'll need to come with us. We have some questions about your body cameras being disabled during a traffic stop." As the officers were led away, Marcus finally turned his full attention to Sarah, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he whispered. "But I promise you, they picked the wrong family to mess with. This ends now." Behind them, the firefighters finally extinguished the last flames of Sarah's car, now a blackened shell of twisted metal. But in its destruction, it had sparked something much bigger, a case that would change their city's police department forever. The police station buzzed with unusual energy the next morning. Internal affairs had taken over the largest conference room, with photos and evidence from the incident covering every wall. Sarah's burned Mercedes had been towed to a secure facility, where forensic experts were already finding traces of accelerant on what remained of the engine. "Play that security footage again," demanded Captain Harris, his face growing darker with each viewing. The video from Ming's restaurant showed everything in crystal clear detail. Officers Richards and Brooks disabling their body cameras before approaching Sarah's car, the unnecessary aggression, and most damaging of all, Brooks clearly pouring something under the hood. Sarah sat in the interview room with Marcus by her side, her arm now showing dark purple bruises where Richards had grabbed her. Her phone, recovered from the burned car, had survived just long enough to upload its recording to the cloud. The video was devastating. "Mrs. Johnson," the internal affairs investigator leaned forward, "we've found 6 other complaints against these officers in the past year alone. All from minority citizens, all mysteriously dismissed. Would you be willing to help us contact these people?" Marcus touched Sarah's hand gently. She nodded, her teacher's instinct to help others kicking in despite her own trauma. "Of course. But first, I want to know about the donation records that burned in my car. Those children are waiting for their money." Down the hall, Officers Richards and Brooks sat in separate rooms, their union representatives looking increasingly worried. The evidence was overwhelming. Brooks had already cracked, admitting they targeted Sarah because she was driving an expensive car in what they considered the wrong neighborhood. "Your client needs to understand the severity here," Marcus told Brooks's lawyer during a brief meeting. "Assault, destruction of evidence, civil rights violations, and that's just the beginning. The FBI is already interested in looking at their past cases. The story had exploded across local media. Cell phone footage from nearby residents showed the car burning against the night sky, while Sarah's calm voice narrating the abuse played over news broadcasts. Outside the police station, a crowd had gathered, community members holding signs demanding justice. Sarah's students had organized their own peaceful protest at the school, wearing black armbands and sharing stories of their own encounters with police bias. The Children's Hospital, hearing about the destroyed donation records, had already reached out to help reconstruct the fundraising data. "Look at this," David Chen rushed into the conference room, holding his laptop. Security footage from last month. Same officers, similar situation, but the victim was too scared to report it. The video showed Richards and Brooks harassing another minority driver, their body cameras conveniently disabled. Phone calls flooded the police department and Marcus's law office. More victims coming forward, each with their own story of harassment from these same officers. The pattern was impossible to ignore. "We've received reports from 3 other precincts," Captain Harris announced grimly. "Looks like Richards and Brooks worked there too, all with similar complaints that were buried. This goes deeper than we thought." Sarah stood at the window, watching the growing crowd outside. Her car was gone, years of work destroyed, but something bigger had emerged from the ashes. Her case wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had cracked open years of systematic abuse. Marcus came up behind her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "The chief of police wants to meet with us," he said softly. "Not just about your case. He's talking about department-wide reforms, new training programs, community oversight boards." "Good." Sarah turned to face him, her expression determined. "Because we're not stopping until every officer learns they can't abuse their power like this. No one else should go through what I did last night." Outside, the crowd had started chanting her name. Inside, investigators continued building their case, piece by damning piece. The wall of silence that had protected bad officers was finally starting to crumble, and it had started with one traffic stop on a dark street, and one woman brave enough to stand her ground. The community center was packed to overflowing. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and crowded the doorways. Sarah stood at the podium, her voice clear and strong as she shared her story. The bruises on her arm had faded, but the memory remained fresh. "They thought they could silence me by destroying my car," she said, looking out at the sea of faces. "Instead, they gave us all a voice." The crowd erupted in applause, many holding up their phones, streaming her speech live across social media. In the front row, Marcus sat beside David Chen and their growing legal team. Over the past week, they'd collected testimonies from over 50 victims of police harassment. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: disabled body cameras, excessive force, and mysteriously lost complaint forms. After Mrs. Johnson speaks, a community organizer whispered to Marcus, "We have 12 more people ready to share their stories." The hashtag Justice for Sarah had gone viral, bringing national attention to their small city's police problems. Local business owners from Fleming Road approached the podium next. Mr. Main from the restaurant stepped up first, his voice shaking with emotion. "When they tell you cameras don't work in my area, they lie. My cameras work fine. They caught everything those officers did, and I'm not afraid to show it anymore." The crowd cheered as Mr. Ming played the security footage on the giant screen. Other business owners followed, each sharing their own videos of police misconduct they'd been too scared to report before. The wall of silence was crumbling brick by brick. Sarah's students had organized their own movement. They sat together wearing black t-shirts with "Our Teachers Matter" printed in bold letters. Many of them had helped recreate the destroyed charity records, working after school to contact donors and rebuild the fundraising database. "The Children's Hospital called this morning," Sarah announced, her voice breaking slightly. "Thanks to the publicity from this case, We've now raised twice our original goal." The audience erupted in cheers again. Something beautiful had grown from the ashes of her destroyed Mercedes. Suddenly, the back doors opened. Everyone turned to see Police Chief Matthews walking in, accompanied by the mayor and several city council members. They hadn't been invited, but Sarah nodded for them to enter. "Mrs. Johnson," Chief Matthews approached the podium, his face solemn. "On behalf of the police department, I want to apologize." He pulled out an official document. "This morning, we terminated Officers Richards and Brooks. But that's just the beginning." The chief outlined the department's new reforms: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, civilian oversight committees, improved training programs, and a complete review of all past complaints. Sarah's case had forced them to finally address problems they'd ignored for years. A woman in the audience stood up, tears streaming down her face. "Last year, those same officers harassed my teenage son. Nobody would listen to us then. But thanks to you, Sarah, they're listening now." More people stood, sharing their stories one after another. The mayor looked increasingly uncomfortable as he heard about years of abuse and cover-ups in his city. Marcus's legal team worked quickly, recording every testimony. "This isn't just about one incident anymore," Sarah said, her voice strong despite her tears. "This is about changing a system that protected bad officers while ignoring their victims. This is about making sure no one else has to watch their car burn while being held back by someone who swore to protect and serve." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. Outside, news vans lined the street, broadcasting the meeting live. Sarah's story had started a movement that couldn't be stopped. As the meeting continued, Marcus checked his phone and smiled. The FBI had just announced a formal investigation into the department's past practices. The state attorney general was getting involved. What started as one terrible night had grown into something much bigger, a real chance for lasting change. 6 months had passed since that fateful night. Sarah stood in front of the newly opened Civil Rights Center, a beautiful building that had once been an abandoned warehouse. The morning sun caught the gold letters on the wall: Johnson Center for Justice and Community Healing. Inside, the walls told stories. Photos and news clippings documented everything, from the burning Mercedes to the massive protests that followed. But it wasn't just about remembering the past. This place represented the future. Ready for the grand opening, Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand as people began arriving. Former officers Richards and Brooks had been sentenced last week, 5 years in prison with no possibility of early release. But more importantly, their case had triggered investigations in 3 neighboring cities. The main hall was filling up quickly. David Chen, now heading the center's investigation unit, was training community members to document police interactions safely. In another room, law students from the local university provided free legal advice to families. "Mrs. Johnson," a familiar voice called out. It was Tommy, one of Sarah's former students, now wearing a police cadet uniform. After her incident, he decided to become an officer himself, to be the change we need. As he put it, 5 other students had followed his lead. Sarah smiled, remembering how far they'd come. The Children's Hospital had named its new wing after her charity organization. The burning of those donation records had ended up raising 10 times the original amount, as people across the country heard her story and contributed. Chief Matthews arrived, looking different from that day at the community center. The department had undergone massive changes under the consent decree. Every officer now wore tamper-proof body cameras, and civilian oversight boards reviewed all complaints. But most importantly, the culture was changing. "You should see the new training program," the chief told Sarah. "We use your case as a teaching example. Every cadet learns about what happened that night and how those officers destroyed not just a car, but public trust." The ceremony began with a surprise. Mr. Ming from the restaurant stepped forward, holding a large envelope. "Mrs. Johnson, our business association wanted to thank you properly." Inside was a check. "Contributions from every shop owner on Fleming Road. For your new car," he said with a smile. But Sarah had other plans. "This money will fund scholarships," she announced, "for students who want to become civil rights lawyers or community organizers." The crowd erupted in applause as she hung the check on the wall, right next to the charred license plate from her Mercedes, a reminder of how change often comes at a price. Marcus took the podium next, his voice filled with pride. "6 months ago, 2 officers thought they could silence my wife by burning her car. Instead, they lit a fire that spread justice across our city." He gestured to the packed room. "This center exists because one woman refused to be silenced." The ceremony continued with a surprise video. Faces appeared on screen. Dozens of people whose lives had been changed by Sarah's case. Former victims who'd finally gotten justice. Officers who'd found the courage to report misconduct. Community members who'd learned to stand together. As the ribbon-cutting moment arrived, Sarah felt tears in her eyes. Her car was gone, but something much more valuable had risen from its ashes. The center would help thousands of people, changing lives for generations to come. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah whispered to Marcus as they cut the ribbon together. "Those officers thought they were showing their power that night, but they actually showed us ours. The power of standing up, speaking out, and fighting for change." The crowd cheered as the doors officially opened. Inside, people were already filling out forms, seeking help, offering support. The burning of Sarah's car had started as a tragedy, but it had transformed into something beautiful, a beacon of hope and justice for their entire community. As Sarah watched her dream become reality, she smiled. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best changes. Her car had burned, but from its ashes, justice had risen, stronger and more powerful than ever before.